But now, guys, we're going into our fourth question of the day. It is a graph question. I know sometimes you guys struggle with your trigonometry functions. Good question for you to pay attention to. Okay, so the question says, in the diagram, the graphs of the function f of x is equal to a sine of x, which means, obviously, we have a variable. We're probably going to need to find that variable. And g of x is equal to tan of b of x, or b times x, are drawn on the same system of axes for the interval x is greater than or equal to 0 and less than or equal to 225. Guys, when you get a question like this, go and double check that you know what the mother graph should look like. Okay? Know that sine of x starts at 0 and 0 and does that and repeats every 360. Know that tan has asymptotes at 90 degrees, 270 degrees, and then it looks all weird. Okay, so make sure you know what the mother graphs look like so you can identify transformations. So question 1, write down the values of a and b. So firstly, our sine graph is given to us by the green curve. We know that the sine graph is supposed to start at 0, 0. At 90, it is supposed to be 1. So we know that our sine graph is supposed to look like this. Cuts the x-axis again at 135, negative 1 at 180. Oh no, wow, look at me, talking absolute nonsense. Comes up through here, cuts at 180 degrees, and repeats. Okay, so very important, guys. That is what your sine graph is supposed to look like, sine of x. Now, if we look at this sine graph, the only thing that has happened is that it has flipped over the x-axis. The intercepts are still the same, which means nothing has happened except it has been reflected over the x-axis. So to get from sine of x to flipping over, you should know that we've gone from sine of x to negative sine of x. That's what happens when you reflect over the x-axis, which means that a is negative 1. Okay, let me get rid of this sine stuff. Now, the tan graph is given to us by the orange. Okay, you guys should know 100% that we should have an asymptote here. Tan of 90 is usually 0. Okay, but now we have the graph cutting it, which means we have to have had a transformation. So, if I look at tan of b of x, okay, we've got asymptotes at half of 90 degrees, okay? So if I look at that, and I've got x equals 45 degrees as an asymptote, which is half of 90 degrees, it means that the period of this graph must have been halved, okay? And if it's been halved, it means that the actual equation of the graph must have been multiplied by 2, or the angle that we're dealing with must have been multiplied by 2. Okay. Question 2, write down the period of f of 3x. We found that f of x is equal to negative sine of x. Okay. The period, it has not changed. We know that the period here is 360 degrees. For those of you who don't know what the period is, it is the amount of degrees that the sine graph takes to repeat itself, to get from 0, 0 to 0, 0. That would be 90, 180, 270, 360. So we know that the original period is 360. If it's f of 3x, you should know automatically, guys, negative sine of 3x, which means that the period is 3 times less than the original graph that we're dealing with. So the period of f of 3 of x is equal to 120 degrees. Okay, you guys must know that. If your period changes, it's because of this number being multiplied by the angle. You take the original period and you divide it by that number. Then lastly it says, determine the values of x in the interval 90 to 225, for which their product is less than or equal to 0. Guys, what less than or equal to 0 means? Less than 0 means we need a product of a negative. Equal to 0 means we need a product of 0. So if I take my f graph and my g graph, in order to get a product of negative, f needs to be negative and g needs to be positive, or f needs to be positive and g needs to be negative. That means that their product, because a negative times a positive gives me a negative, and the other way around. So let's take a look. In the interval 90 degrees to 225, that is the interval that we are dealing with. Okay, so over here, from 90 degrees to 135 degrees, G, which is our orange graph, is positive, and F is negative, which means that their product is negative, which is exactly what we're looking for. So the first thing, 90 degrees, less than or equal to X, and only less than 135, because this asymptote does not get touched. So from 90 degrees, where F or G is 0, all the way up to 135, we're going to get that product. But also, guys, remember, if I multiply F by G, I need to get an answer of 0. At this point over here, both of the graphs are 0. So if I take that value there, 0 times 0, I get 0. So X is also equal to 180 degrees. And that is how you would answer that question. Guys, when you get a product question like that, just identify what they're looking for. If you need the product of the graphs being negative, you need to look where the one is positive and the other is negative. And that's where their product will be negative. Okay, self-explanatory.